Welcome to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to have you with us today, and I'm also happy to welcome back to the program a familiar voice. That would be Alexander Salter. Alex is a professor of economics at Texas Tech University, and Alex, there's a few other hats you wear as well. I'm going to ask you to kind of fill in some of the gaps there as far as who you are and what you do.
Thanks, Brian. It's good to be back. As you said, I'm an economics professor in the business school at Texas Tech. I'm also a researcher at Texas Tech's Free Market Institute, and I hold fellowships with the American Institute for Economic Research in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, and the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. And last but not least, I am an alumnus of the Young Voices Media Talent Training Program.
Now, I'm just going to throw this out there. I follow your work on AIER, and I did that by actually signing up for their daily email, and I see your name come up in there quite often. So there's no shortage of things that you're writing on. I'm looking at an article you did for Real Clear Politics, though, and its title is Conservatives, Not Progressives, Are Freedom's Champions. Give me some context, because if I recall, was this written before the election?
Yes, this was written before the election when Democrats were attempting to rebrand at the last minute as the Party of Freedom, which is really beyond the pale if you understand the direction that this party has taken over the past 20 or so years. What the Democrats have done is doubled down on progressivism. Progressivism as a political philosophy is explicitly devoted to reinterpreting and changing the fundamentals of America's constitutional traditions of ordered liberty. Progressives are very open about this. They think that limited government, the rule of law, representative government in some sense, since they want to weaken politicians and strengthen unaccountable bureaucracies, all that stuff is outdated, they say. We can't afford to have this inefficient, decentralized government system. We need top-down, efficient, expert governance. If the Constitution gets in the way of that, so much the worse for the Constitution. So seeing people who, for years, have said openly that they want to turn America's constitutional tradition upside down on its head, now posing as the defenders and champions of freedom, that just doesn't fly. That dog don't hunt. We need to call it out for what it is. It was just a shamefaced attempt to try and squeeze out a couple of votes in a contentious election, and it ultimately blew up in their faces.
I think your article may be the most appropriate use of the word chutzpah, trying to gaslight an entire nation. And obviously it was a play that didn't quite work out. Why is that? Is it that the electorate has wised up, or is there a larger perspective at play here? Because labels dominate politics, but there's so much label making or label applying. Sometimes I wonder if they've lost much of their meaning.
Well, the immediate issue in the election itself, the presidential election, was, of course, inflation. Americans were fed up with the cost of living being so high. The exit polls conclusively demonstrated that they voted the way they did because they understood that the Biden-Harris administration and their allies were largely responsible for skyrocketing prices all across the economy. So this was, in many ways, a traditional pocketbook election, but also as a secondary issue in the background was an important question about the nature of American government. And I think that this is ultimately about who's in the driver's seat, who's actually going to make public policy. Is it going to be elected officials who are, at the end of the day, accountable to the people every 2 to 6 years? Or is it going to be appointed bureaucrats who, once they get in office, cannot be disciplined, cannot be terminated, and really don't have to answer to anybody? One of these things is representative democracy. The other one of these we call the administrative state, and it's about as undemocratic a phenomenon as you can imagine. And so I think Americans were finally saying, look, we're tired of changing votes every 6 years, but not having any major policy changes. We want the government to be responsive to our demands. That's what democracy means. That's what a government of the people, by the people, for the people means. And if we're not going to have that, then something fundamentally needs to change. And in their view and voters' views, the Republican candidate was on board with that and the Democratic candidate was not.
Now, I have to ask you this because I know you see life and you see the world through the eyes of an economist. So I want to ask you, how do economists evaluate either politicians' promises during elections or the issues that are that politicians run on during elections. Do economists tend to view this with a different vantage point than the general voter?
I think so. For one, economists recognize that for all elections matter, we probably exaggerate the importance that the president of the United States has on the economy on an ordinary basis. Now, interestingly enough, there might be an exception for the Biden-Harris administration because they enacted so much blowout spending. And that's something that did require the president's signature. And then that expansive fiscal position indirectly put pressure on the central bank, the Federal Reserve, to print up a bunch of money, right? To run the printing presses to make the market for borrowing for Uncle Sam look a little bit easier than it otherwise would have. So that's just a fancy way of saying that fiscal follies can sometimes result in money mischief, which is ultimately where all that inflation comes from. But especially with a lot of day-to-day stuff, most of the time we probably exaggerate the importance of the president. Economists are just ultimately skeptical, I think more so than most people, of campaign promises. One, because we recognize that there's no credible commitment mechanism holding politicians to their promises. And two, even when they get elected, what they ultimately end up doing amounts to using other people's money to advancing other people's policies. So it's like the worst kind of incentive problem. You're making policies that will affect millions of people using resources that are not your own, the consequences of which you're largely insulated from. So this is by and large not a good recipe for sound decision making. Usually people make the best decisions when it's their resources on the line and they bear the primary consequences of their actions, which is almost the opposite of what we get in politics these days. And I think a lot of political pathologies come from the fact that there is no accountability mechanism. That's the problem. No one's responsible anymore. Nobody actually takes blame for anything anymore. And we've just centralized too much power in the imperial city in Washington, D.C. And so when you have a one-size-fits-all policy for 330 million Americans, things, of course, are going to go wrong, and yet no one bears any consequences other than, oh, I happen to lose an election.
Talk to me about the moral value of freedom, and maybe we can differentiate between how progressives and conservatives approach that concept.
Ordered liberty is really at the heart of the American experiment. The reason that we value freedom in the American tradition is first and foremost because persons have rights. Persons are a locus of moral meaning, right? It's wrong to treat people as means to your own personal ends. People are ends in themselves. And we also recognize the need for freedom because we need social space to pursue our own moral projects for the cultivation of our own virtues. It's not an individualist thing in a sort of atomistic, I'm separated from society sense. The whole point of granting individuals freedom is so they can associate with other individuals to form moral communities, because that communal setting is how we ultimately build and acquire virtues and live a good, morally meaningful life. And so the conservative tradition in American political philosophy and American politics is all about preserving and cultivating the institutions that create that freedom. Progressivism, again, upends that. It's entirely a notion of freedom. It says you're only free if you can do stuff, and you can't do stuff unless the government gives it to you. So we're going to get away from all these intermediating institutions. We're going to empower the state, and then the government will take care of everything. That's how they think about freedom. They might object to that characterization, but ultimately that's what their policies amount to. And I would regard that as the antithesis of true freedom in the American tradition.
That's one of the best explanations I think I've ever heard. We have about 30 seconds here. Given the outcome of the election, how likely is it that freedom is on the rebound?
Tough to say. I'm cautiously optimistic, but at the end of the day, we have to remember that just because voters rejected one vision of anti-freedom doesn't necessarily mean that they're ready to embrace true ordered liberty. They found something they didn't like, which doesn't necessarily mean that they want to return to the constitutional traditions that made our nation great. So I think that there's reasons to hope for good outcomes, but I think at this point it's too early to necessarily expect them.
All right. Thank you so much again. We're talking with Alexander Salter. He's a professor of economics at Texas Tech University, as well as an alumnus of Young Voices. Where can people follow you on social media?
I'm on Facebook and LinkedIn, so you can find me there. I am not on x.com, mostly because I can't use it responsibly. That's my fault. And you can find all of my writings at my website, www.awsalter.com.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Ryan Silverstein back to the program. Ryan's been on here before. He's a student at Villanova University's Charles Widger School of Law and also a fellow at the university's McCullen Center for Law, Religion, and Public Policy, as well as being a Young Voices contributor. And Ryan, I'm probably leaving a few things out about your life. Any aspects you'd like to fill in for us?
Areas that I primarily research and write about are the First Amendment, administrative law, and state and local government, and to an extent, election law.
All right. So the election has come and gone, and, knock on wood, things are pretty calm right now. I'm looking at an article of yours that was recently published in the, I believe it's the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, 3 ways to avoid more election drama. And before we talk about ways to avoid it, talk to me about some of the election drama, particularly that has been seen in Pennsylvania.
So it kind of first started in 2020 with mail-in ballots, where we kind of had the situation where mail-in ballots were being sent in days after the election because they were postmarked by Election Day. And under Pennsylvania state law, they still accept those ballots and count them. So the result was you kind of had conspiracy theorists going around spreading nonsensical conspiracy theories saying, hey, there are these illegal ballot dumps that are occurring with mail-in ballots that are why Donald Trump lost in 2020. There has been no evidence to support that claim. There were multiple investigations done by the state legislator, by Donald Trump's lawyers in his lawsuits, and he lost Pennsylvania in 2020. And we saw that happen again in 2024. We had a bunch of undated ballots, essentially, try to be counted by Bob Casey's campaign. And you had Mark Elias. He's this Democratic lawyer who's really just a Democratic lobbyist, basically. But him and his little law firm, they were running around the Commonwealth filing these bullshit lawsuits trying to get local elections boards to count these ballots, even though the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania ruled twice that these ballots shouldn't be counted, right? And what was stunning is that you actually had local election boards take initiative themselves and say, you know what, we're just going to ignore the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania's 2 prior rulings and count these ballots ourselves. Because, to quote the chair of, I believe, the Bucks County Board of Elections, precedent means nothing in this country. Yeah, precedent by court doesn't matter anymore in this country, and people violate laws any times they want, end quote. That was from the Bucks County Commissioner of Elections, Diane Ellis Marseglia.
Wow.
Which is just stunning. Wow. Stunning.
So, yeah, I'm beginning to see what you mean by a little drama that has cropped up there. So let's talk about some of the solutions, or at least the 3 ways that we could avoid further election drama as we move ahead.
Yeah, so first, I think, and by the way, these are all common sense bipartisan solutions. I just want to say no particular party has taken a strong stance on this. This isn't about voter access. This isn't about voter ID. This is more specific stuff that both parties, I think, can agree on. And the first one is kind of using the power of the state to preempt local officials. You know, we don't want your local board of elections doing statutory interpretation or state constitutional interpretation to count votes in a manner which they like, which is what we saw happen in 2024 with Bob Casey and the election commissioners in Philadelphia and its collar counties like Bucks and Delaware and Montgomery. We don't want that happening again. And the best way to do that is the state legislator passing a law saying, hey, you guys, you cannot interpret the Constitution. Your job is to only count votes and comply with court orders, not decide whether or not you agree with a court order or interpreting a court order a different way.
Okay. No, that makes sense, and hopefully that would head off more controversy. What about making sure that elections are secure? Because I know, despite you had mentioned there was a lot of conspiracy theories that came out about the 2020 election, and doubts remain as to how secure are our elections. What are some of the steps we could take to make sure people don't have to doubt?
So one of the best ways we can do that is actually by making elections more accessible in Pennsylvania. Right now, Pennsylvania's early voting is really, really strange because it's more like glorified mail-in voting. What they do is you have to go to your local board of elections in Pennsylvania. They have to give you your mail-in ballot as if you received it at home, fill it out in the BOE, put it in the envelope, and give it back to them as if you were mailing in your ballot. And what they do is they just don't count your ballot. They hold on to your ballot for like a week or however long it is until election day. And then they open it at 7 a.m. on election day and count it then, which makes people kind of doubt integrity there because, hey, why can't I go to a polling place and early vote? Why do I have to wait 2, 3, 4 hours to early vote? And we actually saw controversy about this in places like Bucks County. They closed polling places early for early voting, which resulted in multiple lawsuits. And
Mm.
that reduced the public's trust in elections there. So we just need a basic early voting scheme. I don't understand why Pennsylvania doesn't have what states like New York and Florida have, where you can actually go to a polling place and vote like as if it were election day with all the normal voting requirements and submit your ballot and have it counted that day instead of waiting a week and having it being God knows where, like maybe a storage vault. I don't even know where they store these ballots, but they need to fix that. And the second thing they can do to fix elections is actually by actually counting ballots earlier. States like New York and Florida and other states across the country, they allow you to count your ballots, give or take 7 days before the election or even the day they were cast. And the same with mail in ballots, by the way. If you submit a mail in ballot in a place like, again, New York, Florida, they count that ballot the day they receive it. They don't wait until election day to count it. And what has that done? What that's done is very simple. Now we have results on election night, right? Again, New York and Florida are vastly more populated than Pennsylvania. Yet we had results from both of those states within hours of polls closing, like 90% reported. Pennsylvania, we didn't have 90% reported until like 1 a.m. The following morning. That's not acceptable. That's not okay. And any liberal democracy, any functioning democracy can have accessible elections while also counting ballots quickly.
No, I'm with you. In fact, I'm trying to think. I think it was just last week. I know it would have been about the 25th of November. I believe it was one of the races in California. Finally, they said, okay, we can call this race because we finally have counted the votes. And I'm like, 20 days of counting the votes before they could come up with a result. And granted, it was close, but it seems like that's an awful long time to leave people hanging.
Exactly. It's not okay. It's not acceptable. And by the way, these are forms I think people across the country can adopt. There's no reason states like California should be spending 20, 30 days counting votes and they're only at like 93% reported. That's not acceptable. That's not okay. Every other first world democracy on the planet allows early voting. They let you count your votes early. They don't let local election officials preempt the state courts, right? We need elections that are secure and accessible, and the reforms I'm proposing, they allow us to have both. They're not mutually exclusive goals.
I appreciate too that you made the distinction. Look, even these high populous states like New York or Florida, Utah, which I think is just a smidge over 3 million people in population, was still counting votes well into November, for some of their closer races. And look, I don't mean to sound suspicious, but the longer it takes, the more I wonder, okay, what's really going on here? Why is the delay? And that's just my mind, the wheels are spinning. I'm not saying I know that something's wrong. I'm just saying it's suspicious in that it takes a long time.
Exactly, and it reduces faith in our elections. And what's stunning is if you compare us to other functional democracies, Canada, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, they all have election results within like 4 or 5 hours of polls closing, and they have more people than most U.S. states. So again, we can take steps to meet I think the standard of modern democracies, which is counting votes quickly and efficiently, fairly, and having accessible but secure elections.
We've got about 30 seconds here, but I have to ask you, give me your impressions of the Amish participation in Pennsylvania this last election. It sounds like that was something kind of unusual.
It was unusual, but it was warranted. At the end of the day, they were very upset that the current administration came in and started closing all of their farms, and they responded by actually voting. So it turns out policies matter, voting matters, and voting makes a difference. So people should go out and vote, please.
And what was the guy's name? Was it Scott Pressler, who actually went out there and worked on?
Yes.
I got a lot of admiration for that guy. You want to talk about does grassroots work, actually do something? I think the answer may be yes there. Again, we are talking with Ryan Silverstein. He is a Young Voices contributor. Ryan, for people who want to follow you on social media, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can follow me on LinkedIn at Ryan Silverstein. They can follow me on Twitter at RyanRyan916. That's all.
All right. Hey, great to talk with you once again.
You too.
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome James Erwin back to the program. James is a longtime Young Voices contributor. And for those meeting you for the first time, James, take a moment here to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thanks for having me on. Always great to be here. I am James Erwin. I live and work in Washington, D.C. for Grover Norquist at Americans for Tax Reform, advocating for free market policies in internet and telecom spaces and on tech, increasingly working on financial services too. But previously I was on the Hill working for my home state senator, Susan Collins, from the great state of Maine, and was involved in writing the infrastructure bill, particularly the broadband provisions. So my specialty has always been telecommunications. And so this article I wrote that we're going to talk about today goes into some of the behind the scenes of my experience working on this legislation, kind of what it's like to negotiate a piece of a big package like this that moves, ends up as $1 trillion bill all put together, but also where some of the mistakes were made and what the Biden administration has done to make this bill almost impossible to implement. Sort of at the beginning, I mentioned that it has been, at this point, as of today, it is 1,114 days since this bill was signed into law, and not a single house has been connected with broadband service. With $42.5 billion earmarked for that, not one house or business or anyone has been connected in 1,114 days.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you, set the stage for me here. This one did not make it onto my radar screen, but the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment, or BEAD program. What was the genesis of this? Why was it suggested in the first place?
That's a great question. It has been a multi-decade effort to get funding for broadband. This was basically sometime back in the 90s. There was talk of the digital divide that began. It really picked up mostly in the early 2000s. But it's this idea that the internet is going to become essential for participation in the modern world, right? For participation in the economy, to sort of ensure that prosperity was spread evenly. Internet access was going to be essential in the future, in the same way that electricity became essential at some point in the 20th century to be, a real participant in the modern world. And so it comes to be kind of an expected utility that people are able to use. The question then was, how do we get internet service to places that currently do not have it? Well, the answer is the private sector mostly solved the problem. They've invested almost $2 trillion in the last 20 years in expanding their networks on their own. This is privately raised capital. They've been extremely effective. I mean, we've gone from, I think, 70% of Americans using the internet daily in 1990 to almost 95% today. So there are very few areas left where internet connections don't exist or aren't very strong. And for the most part, it's in areas where it's not very economical to build. It's sparsely populated rural areas or places with big geographic barriers, mountains, oceans. Louisiana has the unique problem that everything they build gets knocked over by a hurricane, and it's also low-lying. It's really hard to bury cables there. So you run into all these problems where it's almost impossible to reach enough customers to justify the investment that is required to reach them. And so this estimate was developed long before I was still in elementary school, I think, long before I was working for Congress. The number 40 billion became just the gospel of broadband expansion. That's what it was going to cost to close the digital divide, to connect all the unconnected Americans. And that was the logic behind the account that was created in the Obama infrastructure bill in 2009. That wasn't $40 billion, but there was, I think, a $10 billion fund in that, where they said, well, this is 25% of the 40 billion, and we'll work our way towards that. But the 40 billion just sort of became this meme that everybody believed in, even though it's way out of date, and both the price of broadband has been going down and the amount of connectivity, percent of Americans connected, has been going up for the last 15 years since that number was at all relevant. Nonetheless, when it came to write the infrastructure bill in 2021, that number was still kind of taken as gospel by Hill staffers, myself included. And that was what senators chose when they were negotiating the bill as the top line number. They said, okay, we're going to have $40 billion for broadband. It ended up being $42.5 billion to connect the unconnected areas. Work down from that. And then our job as staffers were just sort of hash out some of the details And the way the process generally works is that the staffers get in a room together. They've got a top line number that their bosses, the actual elected members, gave them, and a set of goals. And then we sort of work out the finer details of it. And anytime there's a real disagreement, we elevate it to the members, right, who make the final decision. I say we, I don't do this anymore, but at the time, this is what I was doing. And that's how you end up with these sort of kind of interesting compromise bills where, the Republicans get some wins, the Democrats get some wins, everybody gets to point to money they're bringing home to their district. But at the end of the day, you have something that's pretty neutral in terms of policy, right? It's not super progressive, it's not super conservative. Nobody gets everything that they want. But there are things that everybody attempts to stuff in that their side wants, that the other side has to say no to, and we have to horse trade away. The problem with this bill is that when it was signed into law by the Biden administration and they began to implement it, the bureaucrats brought in all the stuff that had been cast aside as too partisan that the Democrats were proposing.
James, you mentioned in your article about an opportunity you had to teach some basic economics to a lot of these staffers who were much more senior. They came in with master's degrees, and you mentioned you felt pretty intimidated. But talk to us about the economics lesson that you were able to impart to them.
That's right. So we had a lot of this was. COVID was still lingering, so a lot of this was over Zoom. Not all of it. Sometimes we were in the room together, but a lot of it was just like big Zoom calls with 30 people on them, and this big screen of squares. And I remember, I was one of the youngest people in the room. I did not have a master's degree in public policy like most of those people on the call did. These are staffers for multiple offices, both sides of the aisle. And I casually mentioned when they were talking about Democrats were trying to advocate for rate regulation, which is basically fixing prices for broadband. I casually mentioned, it's like, well, price fixing creates shortages, so I'm not sure that's the best idea. And I started to talk about something else. And then I realized everybody was just kind of staring back at me blankly, like they'd never heard that before. And I stopped talking, and there was just this really awkward silence. And I was like, what is happening to our country? These people who are responsible for writing legislation that's going to affect millions of people and move billions of dollars around like monopoly money don't understand this very basic economic principle.
And I'm going to ask you, we've got a couple minutes here, but why is it? Why do those price controls lead to shortages? Just for the sake of those wondering, why is that?
Well, it's easy to understand when you talk about physical goods, because if you aren't allowed to raise the price of something when it's scarce, well, people will buy it and you'll run out, right? Yep. You won't be able to meet demand. So you have to raise the price where it discourages some people from buying it so that those who actually value it to that degree will pay for it. It's harder to conceptualize when we're talking about a service like broadband, right? But the reason why ISPs need to charge market rates and the government shouldn't be dictating what they can charge is because they have ongoing expenses. So they have to keep the network up. They have to give it upgrades. They have to pay for cybersecurity. And they have to improve service over time as the expectation of faster internet continues to grow. So, and obviously, there's also weather and construction and just all that stuff. So basically, when it comes to broadband, if the ISP cannot charge a market rate for the service, they're not going to be able to fund the quality and the ongoing upkeep. And they end up collapsing. Either you get really terrible service, or they end up collapsing because they're not able to pay off the loans for the capital they had to raise to build out in the first place. With the government micromanaging the price, they don't have the flexibility to respond to either underselling their competitors when they come in and offer a lower price, or they don't have the flexibility to raise prices when something happens that creates a scarcity for the service or makes it more expensive to deliver.
Okay, we're down to our last 30 seconds, but James, I want to reiterate what you said at the beginning of our segment here. Billions spent. How many homes connected?
0.
Wow.
But I will say, look for this money to go flying out the door in the last couple months.
Okay.
As Biden administration wants to keep the Trump people from changing the rules to make it a little less partisan.
Okay.
As it goes out the door.
Again, we are talking with James Erwin. James, fascinating stuff. Now this is on my radar screen. I'm going to have to be following up on it. Where can people find you on social media? Where can they follow your work?
Absolutely. You can follow me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Erwin, that's E as in Edward, RWIN 1854.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays to you.
Absolutely. You too. Thanks for having me.
Welcome back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. Happy to welcome Ethan Watson back to the show. Ethan, for those meeting you for the first time, take a moment, tell them just a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, it's great to be back on the show, Brian. My name's Ethan. I go to the University of Kansas. I got undergrad degrees in accounting and political science. I'm hopefully going on to law school in the future. And I'm a writer for Young Voices, doing a lot of politics and culture writing right now.
Well, I see a piece here that you wrote for DC Journal titled Inside the Gen Z Social Media Echo Chamber. And look, I spend way too much time on social media as it is. And even though I'm a Gen Xer, talk to me about some of the things that members of Gen Z are facing when it comes to social media, and how do they find themselves in an echo chamber at this time?
Right. So I was inspired to write this piece after I noticed after the 2024 election, a bunch of people that I knew who in all other aspects of life are just regular, well-adjusted, smart, people, right? They're my friends, they're my colleagues. And after the election, they were posting a lot of like really unhinged, I would say, commentary about it. Things like supporting a convicted felon over women is blanking insane.
Wow.
Or America, I'm literally so blanking sorry. Like just really inarticulate, kind of ridiculous, hyperbolic language. And so I thought about this, and I think it's a phenomenon I'm calling empowered ignorance. And I'm going to use a little analogy to explain this because I think it works the best. I am completely ignorant of professional hockey. All I know is that the St. Louis Blues were at one point in the last 10 or so years pretty good. So it would be like if I went on social media and I started posting that everyone who should support the St. Louis Blues, and if you don't support them, then you hate watching good hockey and you're denying their existence as a team. And if someone's texted me and said, "Hey, man, they're not that good anymore," I said, "You're a denier and you're denying my identity." And all I responded to was people telling me I'm very, brave for being an ally to the St. Louis Blues. And I get in this little bubble. And then I'm absolutely flabbergasted when they don't win the Stanley Cup. And that is exactly what has happened with this election, is so many people my age were in this feedback loop where compassion is the highest virtue, tolerance is the highest virtue. And so they get caught in this feedback loop, and they were absolutely astounded when Donald Trump and not their preferred candidate, Kamala Harris, won the election. That's why they were melting down, posting these ridiculous outrage videos. I've even heard of people, maybe more in the millennial generation, like not going into work, which is an insane response. It's like, just go on about your life. But I think the empowered ignorance is really what's going on there.
It's so easy to hold strong opinions, but you can hold strong opinions and still be functionally illiterate, in many other areas of life. And that's one of my primary complaints about social media is, as you mentioned, it tends to reward those strongly held opinions as if, wow, you're doing something by bravely standing for something which you may or may not even know a lot about. So how do we reverse that trend? How do we get people to feel invested in what's going on without feeling like, their worth is being judged on, are they compassionate enough? Are they emoting enough on the proper platform?
Right. And I think honestly, the 2024 election may be what did that. I think maybe it snapped people out and showed them that, hey, like this is not how everyone thinks. I make this point in my article, but these accounts that are posting this, they have millions of followers, but the margin of victory that Donald Trump had was way more than the likes that these posts are getting. So even though this is an echo chamber, it's more like an echo shoebox. It's not that big. There's a whole world out there of people that disagree with you. And I think seeing something as, consequential as a presidential election happen, that really is going to illustrate to these people that it's time to get out of their comfort zone. And I've been seeing that. I've seen some friends who I know used to post that, who have been coming to me and just sending me news articles and saying, "Hey, I know you're a Republican. What do you think about this? Can you tell me your side?" And they're actually being very receptive to what I have to say. And so that gives me a ton of hope. But I think this sort of rocked them out of that delusion to some degree. Now, some people are going to stay in that bubble forever, thinking that they have, the most tolerance, therefore they're the most compassionate, therefore they have the moral high ground, which are three separate things, right? Tolerance does not equal compassion. Compassion does not equal the highest virtue, but they've been conditioned to be an ally, and that's the highest virtue. But I think that's starting to change. And I think they're starting to realize there's a whole other group of people they haven't been tolerating, which was normal, hardworking Americans who don't really care about intersectional politics and really just want a strong border, a good economy, a foreign policy that makes America strong and not weak. And that really cuts across these different disparate, racial, ethnic, gender lines that these accounts are often fighting for.
Absolutely. I mean, we have more in common than
Right.
than what they've been led to believe. And yet, like you were saying, just today I saw a lady who had made a video, and I assume it was a TikTok video, and she was like, "All right, MAGA, why are you so silent? How come you guys are? Is it because you know you screwed up? You know, and this is your buyer's remorse?" And I was like, "Oh my word, you can't win." You know, if
Literally.
I don't think MAGA, at least I don't, as far as I know, I don't think they were ever in the habit of going out and burning the town down because, hey, we won. You know, we saved that for sports championships, right?
Yeah, no kidding. Well, I mean, yeah, like most people that were, voting for Donald Trump, it's like, okay, well, I'm getting up and going to work in the next morning. I'm going to class. Like, it's not my whole identity. And look, if Kamala had won the election, you're not going to catch me out on the street burning stuff down. I didn't do that in 2020 when Joe Biden won, even though that wasn't my preferred outcome, because I don't place that at the center of my identity. And also, I believe in our country enough that I love it no matter who is running the show. All right, I'm a little unhappy with it sometimes, but I do believe in it, and I'm not giving up on it so easily, which is why it's so funny when I see celebrities that are like, oh, like I'm going to flee the country to Mexico. It's like, oh, well, we'll see how that works out for you. And the fact that they think that statement carries weight just shows, again, why they lost this election, because no one cared when they endorsed Kamala, and no one's going to care if they leave, right? Because these people, they don't have a hold over us anymore.
No, I think this also makes a very, very strong case for putting politics into perspective. News outlets, and I'm looking primarily at legacy news, but sometimes even conservative news outlets pretend that, boy, the most important thing in the world is politics. It's one facet of our world, and unfortunately, it's one that gets a ton of attention, which I guess could lead people to believe that it's much more important than it actually is compared to other things in life that also matter.
Right, exactly. Especially national politics. And another point I'd like to make about this is there's absolutely, at least among people my age, a social contagion element to this. People are kind of afraid to be heterodox. They're afraid to be perceived as uncaring, especially among young people, young women my age. And the thing is, it's really a lot of performative empathy. It's like the black square during BLM, right? It's like, I'm not sure everyone who's posting the black square, is familiar with the intimate details of the George Floyd autopsy report, but it's definitely performative empathy. And I remember during that movement, even though this is a little bit while back, the catchphrase was, "I understand that I don't understand." And I think we should not be supporting not understanding. We should actually push back on that and say, no, we're not going to empower your ignorance. We're going to challenge your ignorance in a respectful and productive way. And I think that's how we break through this wall.
I think that was one of the great ironies of 2020, and maybe you'll remember this video of people sitting outside at a outside restaurant, and BLM marchers coming up to them and demanding that you raise your fist in support, you chant with us, and what are you guys protesting against? Fascism. Oh, that's an odd way to chant with us and put your fist and make the sign with us. And it's like,
yeah, like they're the ones that kind of look like the brown shirts when you're out marching in the streets, threatening people, threatening business owners on behalf of the controlling party. That's, to me, that sounds like a little bit of fascism.
So, Ethan, how can we as individuals avoid falling into that trap? What's your best advice for breaking out of that echo chamber?
I think it's just going to take a little bit of humility. You just got to ask people who disagree with you in a completely non-confrontational way. It can't be a gotcha moment. You got to just say to them, why do you think what you think? Can you explain to me your position in a reasonable and normal way? And don't take it personally, right? It's not everything is an assault on your identity or your rights, quote unquote, whatever those may be vaguely defined. In fact, most of the time it's not. It really is a difference of opinion, and your opponent is not a fascist. They're not a Nazi. They're not a communist. They're just a human being who voted for one of two major political parties in our country. It's not that deep, really. Actually,
that makes beautiful sense. And I would add this. You can only get a straight answer from them if they know that you're not asking them in order to change their mind. So don't sit there and mentally rehearse. Here's how I'm going to rebut it. Just let them answer.
Right.
See what they say.
Absolutely. Yes, definitely.
All right. We're talking with Ethan Watson. Ethan, I so appreciate this article. I'm going to be sharing this far and wide. For people who want to follow your work or follow you on social media, where can they find you?
You can find me on X at ERWatson13.
Very good. Well, Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. We have a lot to talk about in the coming year, I'm sure.
Absolutely. Merry Christmas, Brian.
All right. Thank you.